So welcome to the Laser Workshop. This is part of a series of workshops that focus on learning from and improving cybersecurity experiment results. We do strive to have a highly interactive, collegial environment for discussing and learning from experimental methodologies, execution, and results. And ultimately, through this, we seek to foster dramatic change, improvements in the experimental paradigm for cybersecurity research, and ultimately improve the overall quality and reporting of practice science. The challenges brought on by cyber are increasing, exponentially. Unfortunately, overall progress in cybersecurity research to meet these challenges historically has been slow and lags behind. And we believe that this is due in part to issues in a number of areas that LASER has focused on over the course of the series. This includes learning from and reporting unsuccessful or unanticipated results, leading to a reduction in the repetition of past failures. Conferences like NDSS encourage positive results. You have to have not just a positive result, it has to be very significant and impactful in order to get through the program committee. So LASER is intended in part to provide a forum where one can take basically negative results, which may still be useful and informative to the community, and to be able to share and discuss those. Secondly, we try to improve reporting of experiments, leading to the ability to understand what exactly was the approach taken, which will help others potentially reproduce those results. And then finally, it's just important in all research and in cybersecurity research to have a solid experimental methodology execution, which leads to more reliable and conclusive results. So the LASER 2020 through 2022 workshops have taken a slightly different tact, and what we have been doing is inviting authors of accepted papers at both NDSS and ACSAC, the Annual Computer Security Applications Conference. Authors of accepted papers are invited to present the experimental aspects of their work. As part of your main paper, your main presentation, there isn't a lot of room, there isn't a lot of time for you to be able to discuss the experimental approach unless that was a core focus or theme of the paper in the first place. So normally or typically it's relegated to maybe a column at most. If you're lucky, maybe a page, sometimes not much more than a paragraph. So our tact has been to invite authors to come talk about that as the main focus. Authors lead a focused discussion on the experimental approaches and methodologies. They're also invited to write new papers that are focused on the experimental work. So the entire paper can be devoted to the experimental aspects of their work. That gets published in post-proceedings after the workshop, and it can be guided in part by the discussions and interactions that occur here as part of the workshop. So here's a timeline of LASER, and this is actually our 10th workshop, as well as our 10th year. I didn't realize this till I was updating the slides last night, but we held our first workshop in July 2012 at SRI International. So I forgot to introduce myself early on. My name's David Ballinson, and I'm with SRI International. It's an independent nonprofit research center. It's headquartered in Menlo Park, California, in Silicon Valley. But my colleague Laura Tennell, who I'll introduce shortly, and I work in our Washington, D.C. office. And so the very first LASER held in July of 2012 was hosted at SRI's offices in Arlington, Virginia. And that continued for 3 workshops, and then we tried an experiment. We tried to co-locate with another conference. In particular, we were proud to be able to co-locate with IEEE S&P, and that really didn't change the dynamic in terms of the workshop. And so for the 5th one, we decided to go back to SRI International. And then more recently, starting in 2020, we've shifted to this new paradigm where we're focusing on inviting authors of accepted papers to talk about their experimental methods. And that's actually been working out very well. As you can see, we've been alternating between NDSS and ACSAC. And this is our third NDSS. And I just realized I need to update the slide. It still says that it's virtual there. It's a copy paste and fail to edit error. So we're actually live in San Diego, California. Well, it's hybrid, right? So we're both live and virtual. But congratulations to Laser on its 10th anniversary and its 10th workshop. I do want to point you at some related work to cybersecurity experimentation. One is an NSF-funded study on cybersecurity experimentation of the future that my colleague Laura Tennell and I did with yet another co-organizer, Terry Benzel from USC ISI. That was done quite some number of years ago, but I think there's still a lot of very relevant guidance, advice, and information in there. We have a current NSF-funded effort that is focused on sharing expertise and artifacts for reuse through Cybersecurity Community Hub or SEARCH. And in fact, one of our co-collaborators on that effort is Eric Eide from University of Utah. Will be giving a invited talk and talking about his reflections on artifacts later this afternoon after lunch. There are other conferences and workshops that have I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So Usenix also has a workshop on cybersecurity experimentation and test, or CSET. So all of us, Laura, Terry, Eric, and I are involved with CSET. CSET actually will occur, it normally occurs in conjunction with Usenix, but Usenix has dropped the workshops temporarily due to COVID. And so ISI and others have continued to support CSET. And so there is a CSET. There was a virtual CSET 2021. There will be a virtual. Actually, I'm not quite sure if it's virtual or if it's actually going to be co-located at Usenix. I think it's going to be virtual, separate from Usenix, but on the same day, that Monday before Usenix. And so and there's an open call for papers. I think the deadline is May 15th, so I encourage anyone who's interested, and you could potentially write and submit a paper to CSET. Then what I was starting to say earlier, there are a number of conferences that have started to do artifact evaluations. One of those is ACSAC. So they started an artifact evaluation initiative a number of years ago. Other conferences in the cybersecurity space have started to do that. Usenix Security does it. We're working with NDSS to see if we can encourage them to do it as well. And then finally, there's a National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine 2019 report on reproducibility, replicability in science that I would encourage you to look at if you're interested in this area. So now I want to go ahead and introduce all of the organizers. I've already mentioned their names, but I already introduced myself. Real quick, I'd like to switch to my colleague, Laura Tennell, so you can see her from her home office in Virginia. And Laura, if you want to introduce yourself real quick.
Hi, all. I'm Laura Tennell, and I work with Dave and Terry, and been working with Laser since the very first workshop. And this is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. Cybersecurity experimentation, and particularly the scientific method that we follow, is really important, I believe, to producing good quality research that's going to solve the challenging problems that our society has. So thank you so much for participating, and I look forward to your talks.
Great, thanks, Laura, and yeah, congratulations. I wasn't quite sure if you were at the very first one or not, but yeah, congratulations to us on the 10th workshop, the 10th anniversary. And then finally, our third co-organizer, Terry Benzel, who leads the networking division at University of Southern California Information Sciences Institute, or USC ISI, who unfortunately has a scheduling conflict and wasn't able to be with us today, but she certainly sends her regards. And she is just as highly supportive as Laura and I are in supporting experimental cybersecurity. I do want to point out the Laser Workshop social media. This is primarily spearheaded by Laura. We primarily use Twitter, though we do also have a presence on Facebook and LinkedIn. And of course, it should be fairly intuitive, will be hashtag Laser 2022. And I don't know, Laura, if there's anything else you want to add in terms of social media?
No, that's good. And you'll notice if people get on there that I have not tweeted anything yet, that's because I just moved into a new laptop and I need to find my login credentials. But that will be fixed shortly.
All right. Let me know if you need any help. I think I've got the password tucked away somewhere. All right. So with that, let's get set for the day and how this is going to run. So it's going to be structured as a true workshop in that it's going to focus on discussion interaction. So folks will be presenting their material, but I've also asked them to leave sufficient time for there to be discussion. I am expecting, hoping that all of you will jump in and ask questions focusing on the experimental aspects of the work. I'm not shy. I'll jump in and ask lots of questions. I'll also pick volunteers, so you'll have an opportunity. Sometimes people just need a little nudge. So we'll lead the discussion in the experimental aspects. The ultimate goal, like I said, is to share and learn from each other and try to improve the way we approach the experimental science in our work. I also want to point out that information about all the talks, the abstracts, the bios, links to the NDSS papers themselves that the talks are based on are available in the Laser Workshop program on the NDSS website. I've got it open here on my iPad and we'll be consulting it throughout the day, and I encourage you to track it as well. Here are some of the areas of interest that we have suggested to the authors that they could talk about that we thought would be of interest to the community. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these are good topics to think about when reflecting about the experimental aspects of your work. So I won't go through all of these, but things like, what were your research questions and or hypotheses? What were the methodologies that you used or developed? What was the design? Did you use any test beds, any specialized hardware? Did you think about human behavior if that was relevant? What were the software tools? And how did you validate, monitor, and collect data from your experiment? Did you use any data sets or develop any data sets? Measurements and metrics are important, as well as the analytical techniques that you use to then come to your experimental results and conclusions. Separately, we step back and we also ask what we call a number of interesting meta questions. So did you use experimentation artifacts borrowed from the community? As I mentioned, there's now a number of efforts for sharing artifacts through these evaluation initiatives at various workshops and conferences, or through GitHub or Search, which you'll learn about later, or through other means. Did you attempt to replicate or reproduce results of an earlier experiment as part of your work as you were sort of setting it up and designing it? What can be learned from your methodology and experience using your methodology? Sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. What did you try that didn't succeed before you got to the results that you presented and documented in your paper? And then finally, did you produce any intermediate results, including possible unsuccessful tests and experiments that you're not embarrassed to tell the community about? So this is the suggested format for each of the sessions. They are 45 minutes. This is slightly different than the guidance that I provided the authors in the email instructions. I decided to skew this a little bit more towards what I've seen in reality rather than what I've aspired for. So ideally, introduce the main topic of the work in about 10 minutes. You don't have to repeat the NDSS presentation. People either went to it or they're able to read the paper or the abstract. Then spend the bulk of your time discussing the experiments or evaluations, including the areas of interest that I listed as applicable. Wrap up by discussing the meta questions that I just outlined, and then at the very end, what are the next steps? And it'd be nice to know what you're thinking in terms of a post-workshop paper. So this is sort of the suggested format and timing. Here's the agenda. Again, this is online. I won't go through all of this because we're right at 8:45, so it's time for the first talk. But there's 4 sessions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. The first session will have a couple of papers. Our first author is actually over in France. They're going to be joining remotely, so I put them in the first slot since they're actually 9 hours ahead. So I said bonjour to them this morning, and they came back and said, yes, bonsoir. So we'll have 2 papers in session 1. We'll have 2 papers in session 2. We'll break with a break in between. We'll then have lunch, come back for session 3. So that first session will include the invited talk, Reflections on Artifact Evaluation, from our collaborator, Eric Eide at the University of Utah, followed by another talk, and then the final 2 talks in session 4. And then we're going to have a brief wrap-up. So we have a wrap-up process that we like to go to. We'll both talk about the post-workshop papers, and we're also going to elicit feedback from all of you in terms of how the workshop went. So, welcome to the LASER 2020-2022 experiment. These are our hypotheses. We believe that NDSS and ACSAC authors are excited about sharing their experimental work. We believe that you, as participants, are interested in learning about other researchers' experimental work, and we also hypothesize that authors and participants in the workshop series can collectively improve experimental science and cybersecurity research. So please take full advantage of the day to help us preferably support, not refute, these hypotheses.